It's the beginning of rabbinic Judaism as well as the beginning of Christianity. So truly, tremendously significant centuries for the future of the world.
Yeah, definitely sounds like there's a lot happening. Um,
Yeah.
of all of the peoples under Roman rule, the Jews were the most rebellious. Why was that the case? What happened? And how are we still seeing the consequences of those revolts today? Hello, my name is Anya Leonard, and you are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Click like and subscribe for more classical wisdom, and check out classicalwisdom.com to sign up for our free newsletter and bring the lessons of the ancients to your inbox. Today's podcast is with Barry Strauss, the Corliss Dean Page Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and Bryce and Edith M. Bomar, Professor in Humanistic Studies Emeritus at Cornell University. Barry is author of many best-selling books, including Death of Caesar, 10 Caesars, The War That Made the Roman Empire, and most recently, Jews versus Rome, 2 centuries of rebellion against the world's mightiest empire. Well, thank you, Barry, so much for joining me once again. As I was just mentioning, you have written so many books, and so I've had the pleasure of discussing different topics with you throughout the years. And this one is really fascinating and I think timely and topical as well, which is Jews versus Rome, 2 centuries of rebellion against the world's mightiest empire. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Anya, for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here again and speak to you.
Well, I think this is a really important topic in part because of the time period in which it takes place. And so I like to start off a bit with the backdrop of your book, which you sort of clarify from the very beginning is from 63 BC to 163 AD, arguably 2 of the most dramatic and influential centuries in Western history. So let's maybe just start off with what was going on at that exact moment.
Okay. So, I mean, this is the era that saw the beginning, the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, the Roman monarchy. Augustus, of course, emerges as the first emperor. So that's the big picture of the Roman Empire. The Romans were continuing to expand and continuing to face their only serious imperial rival, which was the Parthian Empire, the ancient Iranian Empire, which was going strong at the same period on the other side of the Euphrates River. In Judea, so about a century before this, the Jews had reestablished their independence for the first time in centuries under the Maccabees and had created Judea as an independent state. And they lost that independence to the Romans in the year 63 when, because of a factional dispute, both sides invited Pompey the Great, the Roman leader who was in Syria, to come into Judea, which he did with a vengeance. He conquered Jerusalem and took away, punished the state, took away some of Judea's territory, and reduced it to a vassal state, a client state of the Roman Empire. And that sets the scene for the history of Judea and Rome for the next several centuries. But also, of course, this is a period of great religious turmoil in Judea. This is the golden age of apocalyptic thinking, the idea that the world is going to come to an end and that the redemption is at hand, that the kingdom of God is at hand. It's also a period in which the Jews were looking for a Messiah, someone who would restore the house of David and would lead the Jewish world, the whole world, into this new golden age. There are various candidates who claim to be or who were acclaimed by their followers as the Messiah. And of course, the most famous, the most significant is Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, who also lived during this period. So it's the period that saw the beginnings of Christianity and that sees the transformation of Judaism from a religion that was centered on the temple in Jerusalem to a religion that becomes centered on a series of synagogues throughout the world, throughout the the ancient world. So it's the beginning of rabbinic Judaism as well as the beginning of Christianity. So truly, tremendously significant centuries for the future of the world.
Yeah, definitely sounds like there's a lot happening.
Yeah.
It makes it our own time kind of pale a little bit in comparison. That curse, may you live in interesting times. Our times are not nearly interesting enough. We're not. But why was there a sense of the apocalyptic? Like what was happening at that moment that people thought it was the end of days?
I mean, that's a really great question. And I suppose in a way, I don't know. That's probably the most honest answer. But if you think about it, the clash of empires was part of it, and the sense that at least among the Jews, that something big was happening, the reestablishment of Jewish independence after such a long period of time, and then within a century, the loss of that independence. Also, the clash of empires between Rome and Parthia. This wasn't just a theoretical thing. The Romans invaded the Parthian Empire. They crossed the Euphrates, invaded it in the year 53 under Crassus. Leads to a great disaster for Rome at the Battle of Carrhae. And then the Parthians invaded the Roman Empire in the year 40 under their crown prince, a man named Pacorus. And they retake control of Judea about 25 years after it was first conquered by the Romans. So they're clashing empires going back and forth. And I think this was one of the reasons people thought of the apocalypse. I think another reason certainly is the ferment, the intellectual ferment caused throughout the Eastern Mediterranean by the spread of Hellenism, by the spread of the Greek language, Greek culture, Greek ideas. It was a real intellectual clash of civilizations, and on occasion, as in the Maccabean revolt, a violent physical clash of civilizations. And within Judea, there were some Jews who considered the Maccabees and their descendants, their dynasty they put into place, as being illegitimate. They claimed the high priesthood, and technically they weren't entitled to it. And so there were splinter groups known. There were various ones, but one known as the Essenes, who withdrew from Jerusalem. They're probably the people who lived at Qumran in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, whose discovery, beginning in the 1940s, has really revolutionized our understanding of the religious and intellectual life of this period and the background to Christianity. They believed that the end of days was coming, that the redemption was coming, that this illegitimate dynasty that ruled the temple in Jerusalem would be replaced by a legitimate one, by the true priesthood. So there's all this ferment going on, all these ideas going on.
It makes for definitely a good, interesting moment in history.
Yeah,
And it's interesting because I think while a lot of people would sort of automatically know some of those important dates, like the birth of Christ and
right,
whatnot, they
right.
certainly
Yeah,
made it into modern popular culture. But like less, I think, would think of Parthia and their role
yeah,
in this. And I'm kind of curious to kind of investigate a bit more about these sort of clashing empires.
right.
Because obviously the Romans won, so that's kind of the legacy that we live. But is this sort of an example of like Thucydides' trap, where you have these two big empires clashing, that it kind of
Yeah.
it evokes more violence and unrest?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the reasons that I wrote my book was that I wanted to bring in the Parthian story, the ancient Iranian story, if you will. I'm certainly not the first scholar who's noticed it, but I think I put it front and center in a way that not many of my predecessors have. And I think we can't really understand what happened in Judea without knowing that from the Roman point of view, Parthia casts a giant shadow on everything that happens in the Roman Near East. And we know that the Romans held on to the Near East for a very long time, but the Romans didn't know they were going to hold on to the Near East, and it wasn't certain what was going to happen. So, yeah, these empires are clashing, that, and the clash continues all the way to the end, so to speak. It goes on until the 7th century of our era. And it is only ended because a new player emerges on the scene, the Arabs, the first Muslim empire. They push, but they defeat the Romans, the East Romans, the Byzantines push them back, and they crush the Iranians. They're no longer the Parthian Empire at that point. A new dynasty is taken over. They're called the Sasanian Empire. But they entirely lose their independence and they lose their religion. Iran becomes Islamicized. Uh, so, it's a huge cultural shift, a huge political, religious shift. But for centuries, this clash between the Romans and the Iranians, the Romans and first the Parthians and then the Sasanians, the Iranians against first the Romans and then the East Romans, the Byzantines. It just goes on and on and on.
Well, it goes to show there's nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new
Um,
under the sun. No.
but so the Roman Empire obviously is quite large, and at this point, it has many different types of peoples under its rule. It's
Right.
a very vast terrain and covering so many different ethnic groups. So why was it of all of the different peoples under the Roman rule that the Jews were the most rebellious?
Yeah,
Yeah, why did that
that,
happen?
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, to make it clear, the Jews are certainly not the only people who rebel against the Roman Empire. Rebellions are very common. And as my colleague Greg Wolfe once said, for the Romans, rebellion was the price of doing business. They knew it was going to happen. They tried to stop them, but they couldn't. They kept coming. So why did the Jews rebel so often? I think it's partly because the Jewish nation was well established. They had, this hard fight for independence only a century before the Romans came on the scene. They were very reluctant to give up that independence to the Romans. Secondly, I think it's because um, they have three things that they're very passionate about. One is the temple. The second is the Torah, this written document that they base their religion on, they base their lives on, their laws on. And third, the belief in one God. And while all this is going on, it fuels rebellion. It constantly fuels rebellion. I think the other factor that I would add is that the Jews are unusual in that they're spread out across not just the Roman Empire, but they're spread out across two empires, the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. There's a very large Jewish community or series of Jewish communities in the Parthian Empire, mostly in what's now Iraq, Syria, Turkey. And they provide support or at least the hope of support for these rebels. They always think there's an alternative to Rome. There's the Parthians, because there's a long history here. As you know, earlier on in the 6th century BCE, the temple had been destroyed, Jerusalem had been conquered, and the elite had been forcibly relocated from Judea to Babylon, the so-called Babylonian captivity. And then they had been sprung from captivity by none other than a great Iranian king, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, who allows the Jews to return to Judea, to rebuild Jerusalem, and to rebuild the temple. And Judea was a Persian province for about 200 years. And generally, there were very good relations between Jews and the Persians. There's certain cultural, a degree of being culturally simpatico between these two peoples in a way that Greco-Romans and their paganism were not simpatico with Jewish monotheism. Zoroastrianism, perhaps not completely monotheist, but less belief in many different gods than in Greco-Roman paganism. I'm simplifying, forgive me, a very complicated issue.
As you say, there's so much to go into it. It's kind of
Yeah,
hard to kind of put your head around it, but it's such an important history that it's
I think
worth
so.
taking the time
I think so.
to look at it from different angles.
So there are a lot of people in Judea who say, we don't want the Romans. We'd rather have the Parthians. Uh, we have much better relations with them. We trust them more. Maybe our first choice would be to be independent, but if we can't have that, we'd really rather have the Parthians. So Pompey, as I said, he conquers the country in 63 BCE, and then 23 years later, the country is reconquered by a Parthian prince, Pacorus. He deposes the king that Pompey had put on the throne and replaces him with a different king who was favorable to Parthia. There's not a pro-Roman king on the throne now. There's a pro-Parthian king on the throne. And the Romans don't take this lying down, and neither does the pro-Roman faction in Judea. They find a champion. That champion is named Herod, and he goes to Rome. He is crowned king of Judea in Rome, which is kind of bizarre, by the Senate. And he makes his way back to Judea, and there, with Roman help, he spends the next 3 years fighting up and down the country to establish his monarchy, and he succeeds. The Parthians are driven out, and the Roman army defeats Pacorus and kills him, drives the Parthians out of their empire. The Parthians had conquered not just Judea, but Syria and southern Anatolia. And now the Romans drive them out and take all that back. And so there's a pro-Roman king on the throne, but there are always people in Judea who say, that was a great moment when we had the Parthians here, and we want to get them back. And the Romans are very well aware of this, and they're nervous about what the Jews are going to do. So this is a big part of their thinking about the Roman Near East.
It's amazing to think just how influential Herod is in that story. That I mean,
Yes,
maybe the Romans would have picked somebody else to play
sure.
Herod's part. But it does, I mean, open up one's imagination for parallel universes and alternative histories.
Yes, yes. I mean, like Stalin, Herod was a terrible person, a very bloody tyrant, murderous towards his own people and indeed towards his own family. But he was also a brilliant politician, immensely clever, talented, energetic, ambitious. He did great things, the uh, remains of which still survive to this day. So, and his influence was spread so far. In addition to everything he did in Judea, he's also the patron of the Olympic Games. He's elected president of the Olympic Games. He goes to the Olympic Games, and he plays a big role in creating this new city that Augustus builds to commemorate his victory at the Battle of Actium, the city of Nicopolis, Victory City in Western Greece. And, I was standing there in Nicopolis not all that long ago thinking, good heavens, I mean, this is connected to Jerusalem and Herod. The mind boggles, really boggles.
It is amazing that just how international and interconnected at times the ancient world was. And we think it's just
Yes,
such a modern phenomenon, but then you get into even just like going really far back, like the Bronze Age international
yes,
trade and things like that. You're,
yeah.
whoa, 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 this isn't new, you know?
No, I mean, as you know, Baltic amber found in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, you just go, wow.
I know it blows my mind. It's humbling. But to get back to Roman
Yeah.
rule and the Jews, we talk about their rebellion, but how many revolts did they actually have, and what made them different from other rebellions that were occurring throughout the region?
Well, there were three main revolts, but there were some minor ones as well. I mean, one of the big differences is they declare an independent state and they have their own silver coinage, um, which, is a real no-no. Only the emperor is supposed to mint silver coins, and the numismatists say this is the only rebel state that mints its own coins. I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly extremely ambitious in what they do. They inscribe the coins in their own language or a variation of it. Many, if not most, Jews in Judea at the time spoke Aramaic, which is a language very similar to Hebrew, but it's a separate language. I suppose it might be compared to Dutch and German, similar but not the same. They inscribe their coins in Hebrew, and not just Hebrew, but in an older form of Hebrew. It's called Paleo Hebrew, one that was no longer in use at the time. It's consciously archaizing, consciously looking back to the good old days of biblical Judea. And they inscribe their coins. They first of all, as in the French Revolution, they restart the calendar. So the first year of the revolt is year one, and then they name them afterwards. And the coins are inscribed, many of them with uh, for the freedom of Zion. Others are for the redemption. Others are Jerusalem the Holy. So they have a whole ideology. They have a whole propaganda uh, ideology. They're really ambitious, and they seem to be going for the long term. We also have documents that were written at the time, so like contracts and things, in which people would say year three, um, and they also would use some of these slogans. So very impressive.
Yeah, that's amazing. When you create your own currency, you're really operating, outside of the established state. They're like the
Yes.
original Bitcoiners or something.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
But it's interesting to think how they kind of framed it as a completely sort of new world. But what were the kind of the what happened with these rebellions then? I mean, it seemed to me, reading through your book, that there was a lot of unattended consequences that it
Sure.
was not their
Yeah.
aim.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, the big question about these rebellions is, did they ever have a chance? And if you look from the point of view of American history and you ask, why did the American War of Independence, the American Revolution succeed? Um, it's hard to say, imagine it succeeding without the help of France, without the intervention of France. And we know from the ancient sources that the rebels wanted Parthia to intervene on their side. They wanted help either from the Parthian state or from the Jewish communities in the Parthian Empire. And they got some help, but they never got the massive help that they wanted. And I think it's part because unlike the Americans, so the Americans from the word go wanted the French to intervene, and the French basically said, prove it to us that you are worth gambling on. And the Americans proved it in their victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1778. Um, the Jewish rebels never had such a victory. They began their revolt with a bang. They ambush and destroy most of a Roman legion at the very beginning of the rebellion, but they're not able to repeat that success. And so they never get the massive help they wanted from Parthia. The question then becomes, is there any way they could have gotten a compromise peace with Rome? Or was that always a pipe dream? And should they have surrendered? Well, they still could have. Perhaps they could have. Jerusalem was an immensely well fortified city, and they had improved its fortifications at the beginning of the rebellion. But any hope they had of holding out against the Romans was destroyed by the fact that they devolved into factional fighting. The rebels were not united. They were a series of different groups, and they seemed to enjoy killing each other as much as they enjoyed killing Romans. So that destroyed them, and they actually destroyed their own food supply. Um, can you
That's not a
imagine? They
good
burned
tactic.
the grain. No, so they ended up with a famine, and the siege of ultimately Jerusalem is besieged by the Romans. The siege lasts for 5 months, and the Romans win it all. They take everything. They destroy the city. They destroy the temple. They capture and kill almost all of the surviving rebels. Not all of them, but most of them. So it's an utter failure. Whether it could have had some kind of compromise piece, perhaps, but they did not play their cards right at all.
And so the Roman response was quite harsh, right? I mean, why
Yes.
what did they do in retaliation, and was that different from how they treated most rebellions?
Well, so destroying the city of Jerusalem was not harsh. So, I mean, the way ancient wars were fought, according to the law of war, as it was, um, uh, if a city resists a siege, then the besiegers have a right to destroy it. And the Romans often did that. This is not their first rodeo. Of course, as you know, they've destroyed Carthage, they've destroyed Corinth, they destroyed Veii in Italy long before this. So it's not the first time. It's somewhat unusual that they destroyed the temple. Um, the Romans were not temple sackers in the same way, but not entirely unusual. There's so much wealth in the temple still, even after the minting of coins, that even though, so Josephus, the best historian of the revolt, though not an entirely trustworthy one, a great historian, but with problems, um, he says that Titus asked his men, not to destroy the temple. And that may be true, but it's hard to believe Titus could have thought they would have resisted once they are let loose. But beyond that, what the Romans do that's so harsh is that they impose a tax on every Jewish person in the empire, regardless of where they lived, whether they were in Judea or Egypt, where there's a large Jewish community, or Syria, Anatolia, Rome itself. They all have to pay a tax. And the tax is called the Jewish fund, and it goes not to Rome, but to the chief god of Rome, to Jupiter at the Capitoline Hill. So this is not just an injury because they have to pay, it's an insult. Because previously Jews were expected to pay a tax to the temple of God in Jerusalem. Now they're paying a tax to the chief Roman god, as if the Romans are rubbing it in and saying, we defeated your God, our God is in charge now. Furthermore, there's no precedent for this. The Romans never take anyone else, any other rebel in the empire, and say, you all got to pay a tax. So the Germans rebelled, the Britons rebel. In North Africa, there's a rebellion under Tacfarinas in what we might call Mauritania, Numidia. They rebel. Earlier on, of course, there had been Greek rebellions. No such tax singling out a people. So it's very harsh. Furthermore, the Jews may not have their temple anymore, but they want to rebuild it. They still have their Torah. They still have their belief in one God. And they have a network of religious leaders. Even before the temple was destroyed, there were these lay preachers, we might call them, to use an anachronistic term, the Pharisees. And the Pharisees slowly evolve into something different, the rabbis. And they come up with ways for Jews to remain Jewish by carrying out something like the temple service without the sacrifices of the temple, but with spiritual sacrifices, with prayers in the synagogue. It's something that, with many changes, is still the basis of Judaism today. So the Jews show themselves to be quite flexible and to be able to survive even without the temple. But they want to rebuild the temple. The previous temple had been rebuilt within 70 years of its destruction, and they want this temple too to be rebuilt within 70 years of its destruction. But it looks like the Romans are not going to allow that to happen. Re-enter the Parthians.
Well, it's like a cliffhanger. It's amazing because also it would be harder to rebuild if you were paying an extra tax. I mean, and
Yes.
it kind of makes the comment, render unto Caesar. It's well, render unto Caesar's God.
I was just going to say that's really interesting, Anya. It hadn't occurred to me. So this is, I mean, the quotation from Jesus is render unto Caesar things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God. But here, as if the Romans are saying, no, we want it all. Render unto Caesar and render unto Caesar's God. So thank you. That's really interesting.
Oh, glad to help. As you're saying, this is a part of history that I think a lot of people know some segments of it regarding like the destruction of the temple or maybe
Yeah,
Masada.
right, right,
Obviously, it is such a critical point on time.
right.
But were there any misconceptions that you thought or sought to challenge in this book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, um, uh, and I wanted to, I'm afraid the title maybe of the book might reproduce one of the misconceptions, and that is that this is only about Jews in Rome, because it's not. There's a third player in the story, and that is Parthia, and Parthia becomes even clearer in the second revolt, and also in the third revolt. I guess another misconception that I wanted to um, correct is that why were there so many rebellions? I think one of the answers is the Jews are ornery and rebellious. They were. They were ornery and rebellious. But there's also the fact that the Romans mismanaged the situation so much. The Romans underestimated the enemy. They underestimated the Jews, and they instead of remembering Churchill's dictum, which is in victory magnanimity. Instead, their attitude was in victory be nasty. So that fed the fires of the additional revolts. Um, And also Roman imperial overreach when Trajan invaded Parthia and didn't think, gee, the Parthians could incite a rebellion by the Jews in my rear. Um, that's something they didn't recognize as well. Um, and I think the Romans also underestimated Judaism because they thought if we just destroy the temple, then the problem's over. The temple is the epicenter of the revolt, which is true in a way. It was the epicenter of the revolt. But the idea that you could snuff out rebelliousness by destroying the temple and then rubbing it in with this new tax to the Capitoline Jupiter, that's tremendous imperial mismanagement. Um, uh, and so I think that's part of a misconception that needs to be um, taken into account as well.
So, do you think from the Roman perspective, how they viewed their own temples would kind of illuminate why they would think that the religions were because they had sort of a more broader pantheistic religion that you have a different temple for different gods, that this fact that Judaism is more centralized, the need for a location wasn't as important? I don't know, I'm just riffing here.
Well, it's both that Judaism is more centralized and it's less centralized. So for the Romans to have paganism, you got to have temples. It doesn't work if you don't have temples, right? I think if you close the temples, which indeed happens under Constantine in the East and then under later Christian emperors, they close the temples. How are you going to practice paganism? It becomes very difficult to practice paganism without temples. Yes, there are household cults, and yes, there are neighborhood cults and things. And you can certainly swear by the gods, but it becomes very difficult if you don't have the temple. So I think that's very insightful on your part, Anya. If you, from the Roman point of view, you close a temple, you're snuffing it out. But they underestimated the kind of grassroots nature of Judaism. They underestimated the Pharisees and later the rabbis, and they underestimated the importance of the Torah as a document that would allow Judaism to exist. And also the fact that for the Jews, this is not their first rodeo. They've already been sent into exile, and they've already come up with strategies to survive exile, or otherwise they could never have survived the Babylonian captivity. So, yeah, I think the Romans are engaging in what so many imperial people do, and that is called mirror imaging. You think the enemy is just like us, but the enemy's different.
And it sounds like the Jews were much more anti-fragile in that regard, that because they'd had the ability to regroup in the past and to exist outside of a realm.
Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the takeaways from my study is just the amazing resilience of the Jews. The fact that they were able to regroup in the way that they did. And I guess I would also say not just the resilience, but the agility and flexibility, because after all, these are the same people who originate Christianity. And, on the one hand, they are remaking their national religion. But on the other hand, they're laying the groundwork for an international religion, and it comes from the same period. And of course, Christianity is very different in many ways, but there are other ways in which it's still based on Judaism. And of course, and indeed, it takes centuries before the two of them become as separate as they ultimately become.
Very, very last question, because you've already been very generous with your time. And I do want to just take one last opportunity to sort of tie it in to our modern listeners, who I
Right.
know there's some that are going to be Jewish and there's going to be many who are not Jewish.
Yeah.
But what would you think is sort of a good takeaway, a good lesson to learn from how the Jewish people dealt during and after these catastrophic wars and rebellions?
Yeah. Well, Jews love debate, speaking as a Jew, and there is a debate about these rebellions. I think there are many people who would say that these rebellions were nothing other than a catastrophe and a disaster, and the rebels were terrible. They should have accepted Roman rule and kept their heads down. And if they had done so, the Jews would not have been exiled. They would have stayed in their homeland, and the temple would have continued. But there's others who would say that's naive. Um, if the Jews had not rebelled, the Romans would have looked down on them, and sooner or later they would have helped themselves to the temple because the wealth was just too tempting for greedy Romans. In addition, there were already temptations for Jews to assimilate and to become Roman and to give up their ways. And the rebels, for all their flaws and for all, the disasters they unleashed, created a model of resilience and determination and resistance. And that model turned into one of spiritual resistance, and spiritual resilience is what allowed the Jews to survive. So I think we want to contemplate these revolts and kind of think about them and say, well, how do we survive today, whether we're Jewish or not, whoever we are? How does a people survive in a world full of changes and buffeting winds? Is it going to be violent revolt, or is it going to be spiritual revolt, spiritual resistance? And to the two of them, are the two of them utterly opposed to each other, or do they sometimes work together? So I think that's a question that we can all take away from this.
Well, thank you so much, Barry. It's always, always a pleasure talking with you. And as you very eloquently put, it's such a fascinating time period. And as you're telling the narrative, I mean, I'm just on tenterhooks many times. So I recommend everybody to check out your book so they can get the full story because you did definitely leave us with some cliffhangers. And thank you once again for speaking with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. To learn more about the ancient world, go to classicalwisdom.com to sign up for our free newsletter. And if you enjoy our work, please make sure to like and subscribe.